Okay, good evening, everyone. I can see some of you, but that's fine. We don't need to see all of you because you'd be tiny otherwise. So I'm Sarah Naish, and I'm a therapeutic parent, trainer, author, and keynote speaker. And I also worked in children's homes where there's been very high levels of violence. So I'm going to be chatting to you today, but just the 1 hour we have. So Gerard, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi everybody, Gerard O'Dea here. I'm a Director of Training at Dynamis. For about 15 years now, my job has been to help usually teams of staff in lots of different environments, healthcare and social care, education, to deal with the people they meet in their work who become distressed, upset, frustrated, and even violent, and to deal with those situations in the best way possible to get the best outcomes they can. And I've been working with Sarah and the team and Jane for several years now on a project to help parents who are dealing with violence in the home context to do, you know, the best possible things they can to manage the situations they're in, following the regulations, the guidance. I'm an expert witness, so my perspective on this tends to be from a legal point of view as well as practical, and I hope to be able to help you all tonight.
Thanks, Gerard. Jane, do you want to just unmute yourself? And you just need to unmute yourself, Jane. We can't hear you. That's it.
Oh, it's okay. No, I couldn't unmute myself.
You've got an echo on your line.
I've got an echo on my line.
Jane, it's because you've got your mobile phone on.
I know. There we are. I got rid of it. Sorry, folks. My phone usually has a better microphone than a laptop, so I was trying to connect through that, and it just wasn't working anyway. So, hi, here I am. Some of you will have seen some of my other webinars. Hi, Dennis. Nice to see you. And I'm here tonight with Sarah and Gerard because we really know quite how tough it is for people that are struggling with their children who can be very violent and aggressive, and we've all been working together, as Gerard says. This is only a very short webinar, so it's just to give you some very quick overviews and then some places to go to for more information, really. And it's lovely to see so many of you.
And Jane, you are an adopter as well, aren't you? And you have first-hand experience of child-to-parent violence as well. Probably important to mention that.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. I was just saying I was just letting everyone know that you're also an adopter and have first-hand experience of child-to-parent violence.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sarah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, we've got quite a lot of questions that came through, and because we've only got an hour tonight, we won't be able to answer all the questions, but don't worry, we won't leave you with nowhere to go. We will be telling you towards the end where you can go and the help that we offer. And we are great believers in giving you practical, real help and not just kind of airy-fairy solutions. So they will have direction at the end of what you can do. One of the things I just wanted to start off with, which actually answers quite a lot of questions that have been answered. People have asked about consequences for violence, or you know, how they can do agreements with children that will make them kind of not be violent in the future. And for those of you that haven't heard my little analogy about the plane crash, I just wanted to remind people that, you know, if you're sitting on a plane and then the plane goes down and you've got to get off the plane, as you're trying to get off the plane, if there's a little old lady standing in front of you blocking your exit, you will push her out the way. You're very likely to push her out the way because you're in survival mode. With our children, because they have very high levels of cortisol, almost equivalent to you being on a crashing plane, our children often, the violence is around people being in their way and they're trying to get away and they're trying to get out of the way. If you're on a crashing plane and you push somebody out of the way and then you've got off the plane and then the air host comes up to you and says, look, you know, you were very rude a minute ago, you just pushed that person out of the way and you won't be able to fly with us again unless you sign a contract or agree that you will not behave in that way again. You know, it doesn't matter what contracts you sign or what agreements you make. I can assure you, if you're in that same situation again and you need to get off a crashing plane, you will still push the person out of the way. So for those of you that have asked about doing deals and consequences, if the child is dysregulated, i.e. if they are not in control when they are violent, which is almost always the case, there is not really a consequence you can put in place that will help them to not repeat that behaviour in the future. It's self-defeating, really. So, Gerard, I didn't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
I think it's a great analogy, and I think, you know, what I've taken from working with you over the last few years is that idea that often we need to wait quite a bit of time for the person to, the little person to calm down and to regain some level of normal functioning before we start talking about consequences. Like, so that delay in time is really important, but also to realize that really when, you know, we talk a lot about the point of no return. So I saw in a lot of the comments that people can see that the child's becoming dysregulated and losing their self-control. One has to realize that after you've passed the point of no return, and many of you would recognize that phrase because you've seen it and you experience it, the person becomes what we describe as sort of primal. So it's a moment where they're being very protective of themselves. It's a survival moment, a self-protection moment. And quite literally different parts of their brain are engaged, and it's all very self-oriented behavior. So very difficult really to sort of link that behavior to any kind of consequence in any rational way. And like you said, there's really no point.
Yeah. Jane, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, really, you know, these children, especially at the moment in COVID, they're being hijacked a lot because their trauma memories are very close to the surface, and that's because of the situation that we're all in. And so their cortisol levels are immensely high all the time, which means that the reaction, that fight-flight response that Sarah's got the excellent analogy for, Gerard was talking about, happens much, much quicker. And although a lot of you have said, well, they're laughing at me, or they're doing it deliberately, or they are in control, but laughing is often it's often just like a nervous tick reaction, and they might seem to be in control, but actually they have to be in control, because otherwise they won't survive. We have to remember this is about survival for these kids. That's the bottom line of it. And the reason they go from 0 to 100 on a split second is because it takes less than a split second for the fight-flight response to kick in. And if you've already got high cortisol, it won't take much for that to be generated by something like you saying no.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's something that's come up quite a lot in our questions, isn't it? Where people have said, you know, when I say no, or somebody said something about a certain type of food, or if they don't get their own way with the food, that is a trigger. If you've got a clear trigger, some of you have said, quite a lot of you have said, there seems to be no trigger, that it literally the behaviour comes from nowhere. The behaviour always does come from somewhere, but we may not be able to identify that, and we may never be able to identify that. So don't beat yourself up too much about that, and it's about what you do when that behaviour is presented to you. There's a couple of really quick questions which we can answer easily. Do these techniques apply to children with on the autistic spectrum or with ADHD? Absolutely. You know, many of our children are diagnosed, misdiagnosed with ADHD or the autistic spectrum. Trauma's trauma, and we see a lot of these behaviours that look like that. So yes, definitely. And somebody's asked particularly about how they stop themselves reacting, how they stop, you know, so there's a trigger. So it might be like the child starts doing something and you can feel yourself going up. We've had a lot of success using havening techniques to remove triggers. Now, afterwards, Rosie will send you all the link to the Haven, and that is a more involved intervention where we'll first of all talk to you about the extent of the problem on a one-to-one basis. Then we bring in Havening, which takes the triggers away, so you're not being kind of triggered to respond. And thirdly, you get the strategies. So we'll give you a link to that later on. But anything to do with your own triggers, we would be talking about, you know, that 3-step connect program we talk about.
Also, if I can just quickly say, the thing is with it's easy for us to follow our children up into that place when they're going, because we're very connected. And one of the things that we talk about on our courses about managing violent behaviour is Sarah's parents model. And the very first thing you can do to help yourself is to pause. Pause, take a step back, let your brain reconnect, and then try and make a connection with where the behaviour might be coming from. Think about the history. And then figure out whether you actually want to have a battle with this child, or whether it's something that you can decide to take control by stepping away from it.
Thanks, Jane. Some of the questions, particularly around, you know, what do I do when they don't get their own way? What do I do when violence erupts in the car? What do we do around the violence around food? What I can say to you there is, it's in the A to Z. Like, look in the A to Z of therapeutic parenting, look up food issues, look at car journeys, travel. But I think, Gerard, you might want to say something about travelling in the car, because you've got some quite good stuff around that.
Yeah, I mean, we've worked with teams who have fitted particular types of car restraining devices, you know, like different kinds of seatbelt essentially in their cars. But also you want to, like in any environment, including your home, including any places that you go to, and especially in the car, you need to think about what's going to slow this person down if they want to get to you. So obviously being able to grab your hair or punch you or slap or grab hold of your clothing or whatever it might be requires a certain amount of proximity. Like, they need to be close to you. So you want to look at your car and think, where can I place this person when they sit in my car to make it just that little bit slower for them to be able to get to me. So we talk a lot about pre-cues. So nobody can get their hands into your hair and twist them around without doing several things first. And we have to become, when we deal with these people, these children who are doing this, we need to get really familiar with what the early physical movements are, and we call those the pre-cues. And so obviously everybody wears a seatbelt in a car. So when the child's in the car, the first thing they have to do is somehow get past the seatbelt to get near you. And there are, I know for sure that if you go on Amazon, there are certain devices you can buy which are seatbelt guards, which you can put on a seatbelt device that makes it harder. It's supposed to make it very hard, but you know, we know our kids are really good at this stuff, so it just makes it harder for them to be able to jump out of their seat. So sort of trying to manage your physical environment as much as you can to make it harder for the person to actually get close to you is a really key strategy. And I may return to that later on. Is that what you meant, Sarah?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, thanks, okay. Gerard. Yeah, I mean, I used to, when my children were violent, they weren't particularly violent towards me when I was driving, but in the children's homes that we ran, there was a situation once where a young person leant towards the driver and got something and pulled it around their neck and actually really injured them. And obviously that young person wasn't allowed to go in the car anymore. There's quite a lot of bus journeys and walking. So think about that kind of thing. But I used to, if my children were being violent to each other, I would stop the car. You know, I'd get to the side of the road and I would stop the car. I wouldn't keep trying to drive. You know, I think that gives quite a strong message as well to our children. Normally, in our 2-day course on managing violent behaviour, we do a whole day on de-escalation and we look at all those strategies. And on day 2, Gerard or his team, they do some physical protective strategies, which obviously we can't do in this type of environment. But I just wanted to make you aware that those sorts of things are available. There was another good question here, actually, that somebody asked. It came up a few times, and I think it's interesting because it raises some other things. Like, when do you call the police? That's what the question is. When do I call the police? And the reason why I wanted to just raise that is because there's quite a lot of thoughts around that. Because does it mean that if you call the police that you're undermining yourself and you're making it look like you can't manage? It doesn't make the child feel less safe. I don't know if you wanted to tackle that, Jane, about calling the police.
Yeah, well, speaking as someone that has called the police on several occasions, sometimes it isn't an option. And sometimes you have to do that to keep yourself safe and to keep the child safe. And it's really important to remember that in the middle of a violent incident, that is all you're trying to do. You're not therapeutically parenting, folks. You are doing what you have to do to keep yourself safe and the child safe. If you're alone in the house, if the child has got a weapon, if something very, very dangerous is going on, you're not going to be trying to de-escalate. You're not going to be waiting for the child to hit you or to cut you or to put a ligature around your neck, as Sarah was describing. You're going to be doing everything that you can to keep yourself safe. And if that means that you need to call in the help of the local police force, then that's what it means. And sometimes that's the only way that you're going to get any help from anybody as well once the police have been involved sufficiently. It's not, I mean, obviously it's not your preferred option. Obviously it's not. But sometimes it's necessary. Be guided by yourself. You're not going to call the police just because they've gone upstairs swearing at you and calling you an effing bitch or whatever it is that they've done, or slammed the door. You're not going to be calling the police for that. But if they've got a knife and they might hurt you or they might hurt themselves, then you are going to be calling the police. And they're still very confident of your skills.
Yeah,
Gerard.
Could I jump in there? One of the things that I talk about a lot when we do these courses is, when I say to somebody, look, you need to maybe do that assessment around your home environment. One of the things we often suggest is that you, especially those of you who might be living, and I saw one of the questions is about somebody who's living with a teenager, a young man, let's say, who's big and strong and maybe taller than the person he's living with. The most common advice that I give to those people is you need to find a place in your house where you can go to. You need to put a big strong door on that room. You may need to change the hinges, put some industrial hinges on there. I often tell the story with a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek, but it's a very serious point. So that you can go there, you can shut the door, and then you can make that phone call that Jane's talking about. So I know that might sound very obvious in some ways, but if you need to phone the police, it's going to take a couple of minutes to get that phone call done. And you had better be, I would suggest you need to be safe while you do that. So, a big strong door, something you can lock or bolt, and put a good strong bottle of brandy in the cupboard so that once you made the phone call, you can sit down and take a load off. But that idea of isolating yourself from the violence and chaos that might be going on outside the door is a really important one. And I know it creates questions around your role as a therapeutic parent. But I think Jane's already mentioned that at the point where you might get seriously hurt by this child, you need to make yourself safe for both of your for both of your sake.
Can I just add to that briefly as well, because this is, some of you have got more than one child, some of you have got more than one child and several dogs, or whatever else you've got. So have a plan. Most of the time the reasons that situations can really escalate is because you don't have a plan. Make yourself a plan. Do I need to know, where am I going to put the dog when the child escalates? Where am I going to put the other children when the child escalates? And then think, where's the safest place to be with this child? So if they're a child that is following you, lead them to the place which has got the most soft comfy, cushiony, duvet type things like their bedroom, rather than to a kitchen where there's weapons or a sitting room where there's weapons. And then, you know, do as best you can to keep things safe within that room, or put yourself into your safe room. If the child is walking away from you, slamming doors, kicking, shouting and swearing, do not follow them. You don't need to. Let them be. And when they've burned themselves out, you can talk to them after that.
Yeah. Gerard.
So I had this conversation with some foster carers the other day, and where we talked about soft furnishings and so on, Jane. And I know there was a question that came up in the list of questions for tonight, where somebody wondered about, you know, should I provide a punch bag or something to hit for the child, or is that just encouraging violence? And I think that's going to be horses for courses. You might need to test that out and just see how it goes. But it was a really interesting discussion the other day where I spoke to some foster carers, and I said, look, they had a 6-year-old girl who becomes really violent. And I said, let's talk with her about what kinds of things she can do when she gets really upset. And then, you know, then you can introduce some cushions that you can use as little punch bags. Now, you got to be careful if you're using them that you don't get accidentally hit or hurt. And we even progressed that discussion to say, well, why don't you go down to what's the name of that bargain?
Home bargains.
Home bargains. You know what I mean? Down to Home Bargains, stand in the aisle and pick out like these really cheap cushions that you're going to fill this room with. The room that Jane is suggesting that you lead the child to, which is, you know, the cushion room. You seem to be really upset. Let's go to the cushion room. And then the child can throw, hit, kick, run into, bang their head off, as many soft furnishings in that room as they want. And I think we might even be able to involve them in the process by discussing that at the appropriate time as well. So it's something to think about. Sarah.
Yeah, I certainly did that with my son, who used to be quite dysregulated and kind of throwing things around. And in the A to Z, I've got a thing about how to plan a bedroom. There's a little drawing in there, and that can be really good. A lot of this is around thinking ahead, because some of you will be facing things in the moment, and when you're facing things in the moment, quite often thinking, I wish I had done, or I wish I'd thought. So when that's finished, go back over that and think, what could I have done? What could I have put in place which would have made that a bit easier? Sometimes there isn't anything. Sometimes it's come from nowhere. You don't know what happened. You don't think there's anything you could have done differently. But sometimes there's something really obvious. Thinking about really obvious things, we've had quite a lot of questions that, to be frank with you, boil down to unrealistic expectations. And I think it's really important that we bear in mind the emotional age of our children that we're dealing with. So some of the questions is around children who are very young, perhaps under 5, who are not showing empathy or remorse. Breaking news, you absolutely will not be seeing empathy or remorse in traumatised children below the age of 5, and probably not be there the age of 14. So if you've got a child who is hurting another child or a baby, and it's triggering you because your young child is not showing any remorse, they don't have remorse. So it's about being very clear about what your expectations are and taking charge of that. When you're dealing with a very young child, I'm talking about a 2 or 3-year-old child, and they're being violent or aggressive towards a younger child, what you need to do there is you need to be absolutely seen to be the unassailable safe base, the person who is in charge and the person who is saying, stop it now, that's not okay, and taking action and moving the child away and making it clear that you're not creating those opportunities or allowing those opportunities. Sometimes there's a little bit of a misunderstanding about therapeutic parenting, and people get it mixed up with attachment parenting or gentle parenting, I should say. It isn't about always being gentle and sweet and saying, oh dear, I think you're really struggling. It's quite often out saying, stop that now, that's not okay, you know, you will not do that. And that is therapeutic parenting just as much as all the empathic stuff. And if you are not doing that, if you are If your reaction to violence is, oh dear, oh please don't hurt me, oh no, I can assure you the child sees you being scared and it will escalate the violence. So you do need to be strong and calm and assertive and therapeutic, even if you are actually quite scared. And I know that's easier said than done, and I've done that. I have been in that situation. You have to fake it till you make it. Jane, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, because I'm very aware that for a lot of people, it's just kind of they've got the Jekyll and Hyde child, and the Jekyll and Hyde child takes you by surprise every day of the week, don't they? And I think what we have to do really is we really have to think about what was their previous history and experience. I've seen a couple of comments coming up about children that are directly targeting an adult, and they're, you know, not stopping. So no, you don't zip it and take it, Salima. You do not zip it and take the violence. That's not what you do. You get yourself safe, you get the child safe. Afterwards, you talk to them about what happened and do some sort of repair with them. There'll probably be a logical consequence of some sort, if you think about it hard enough. But the main job, folks, with violence and aggression is the therapeutic parenting that you're doing day in and day out, linking their behaviour to their unmet needs and linking their behaviour to the history, so that, for instance, some of your children will have experienced domestic violence, and in that case, they will know that they have to be the stronger, more violent person to win. That's what they'll know because that's what they've experienced. It's really important for you to know the history of your child, and then it's really important for you to get some help with how to link their behaviour to their history and remind them that that's not where they are anymore, and that they're not that person, and that they don't have to be that person. But that's the long job. Looking at somebody that's been doing that job for 18 years, that's the long job. The short-term job is what you do in the moment, and in the moment you must have your safety plan so that you can keep the child safe. Put all of your lovely breakables away for now, please, and just while you're doing the therapeutic parenting long job, make sure that you keep yourselves as safe as possible.
Gerard.
Yeah.
So I just thought I'd follow up on that whole idea. I think, again, the conversation I had the other day was around property. I think one of the things we need to sit down and do is say, right, well, what property do we have that we are really attached to ourselves and that we don't want the child to damage? Then there's another question, because that property should then go on a list of things to get to move or put into that room that the child can't get into. Secondly, we need to look at perhaps property objects that the child is trying to damage, and ask ourselves a question about that. For example, the other day I was talking with the foster carers, and the little girl that they look after will turn around and kick a radiator, and kick it really quite hard until, you know, everybody looking at her is thinking, gosh, she must be hurting herself. But then she stops, and maybe she moves on to something else. And they found out that she'd been complaining at school of having sore toes. Sarah will probably enjoy the kind of background to the story, but she was complaining at school about having sore toes. But what it says to me is that most people, most children have a self-protective instinct, and most people won't kick a hard or solid object until it injures them and they go down with a broken something or other. And we I think, as part of the pre-planning that Jane is talking about, we need to kind of put these behaviors around damaging objects into boxes in our mind that says, okay, she's kicking a radiator. For one, the radiator is unlikely to come off the wall or be damaged. And number two, it is that hard that it's probably going to cause some pain at some point. And in the middle there, we're hoping that that behavior will stop. But I just want to caution everybody, there's no duty of care in law to jump on that child and drag them off kicking the radiator. because ultimately the radars are very hard to damage and relatively easy to replace, actually. So we as part of our analysis, we do this kind of assessment of the property and the things that people are trying to break. And I know that there are more expensive things that can be broken, but again, that goes into the analysis.
Yeah, thanks, Gerard. While you were talking there, it reminded me about, you know, one of the techniques that we need to make sure we're doing, because I can always hear people saying, well, you know, but my child does this and then that happens and then that happens. And we've got a question on, you know, for example, what's happening during the COVID-19 thing and how things seem to be more intense and it comes out of nowhere. One of the questions about an awful lot of violence from a 6-year-old since Easter, only been with you for 9 months. He's experienced a lot of trauma. One of the things where you've got, it looks like a particular time or an anniversary or birthday or whatever, a lot of the time what we do is we become aware that the child's violence goes up at these times and we forget to tell the child. We forget to say to the child, I've noticed that at Easter, you really struggle, and the way you show me that you are struggling is that you do X, Y, Z. So that's called naming the need. And what we're doing there is we're giving the child a different narrative. So rather than saying, you know, at the moment the narrative they have is I'm a bad person, and I know I'm a bad person because I hit mum because I was out of control and I can't control myself and I'm a bad person. So what I would try and do is say, I noticed earlier on, you know, when you punched Jonathan, that, you know, and you were really wobbly, you didn't know what you were doing. I think that what was going on there was that this and this was happening. I don't ask the child, I tell them my best guess. It doesn't matter if you get it wrong, because whatever narrative you're giving them there shows them that A, you're thinking about it, and B, it's better than you are an evil person. And the more that you do that, and the more the child starts to think, oh yeah, no, the more control they get over their own behaviour. So naming the need is one of the most powerful things you can do for your children, especially your littlies actually, who are just starting out. And that's how I help my children to get a grip on their violent behaviour.
Also, we must remember that it is COVID-19, it is unprecedented, it is bringing up trauma memories, and that is happening across the country. It absolutely is. Now, quite a lot of your comments, you know, were about control of various sorts, about parents worrying about not being in control. And I think a lot of the time, what we're worried about is that we can't control the child. And when we think we can't control the child, we end up kind of stepping up and stepping up and stepping up in opposition to the child. And that never works. It never works, because it's like there's already a bit of a fire going and you're dropping petrol onto it.
Yeah.
So you're going to spark it up any day of the week. And the way to take the petrol out of that fire is for you to decide to step back from it. So they want to have the last word? No worries. They want to get a rise out of you and tell you how awful you are? Yep. No, you're probably right, actually. Do you know, I hadn't thought about that. And if they're left with nothing to push against, they do back down. Whatever they're saying to you, you can say, yeah, you're right, actually, I probably am acting a bit like a child today. I feel a bit like a child today. Never mind, hey ho, I think I'll go and make a cup of tea now. And I know it's hard, because I know that some of you are also facing swearing and awful language, and that you're finding that very worrying. But what Gerard and I usually say when we're doing this course together, which we've done it kind of, at one time we did it side by side just for one session for various reasons. And the thing is with language, it doesn't hurt you. It isn't hurting you. It's hurting your feelings. It's not hurting you. So you can afford to ignore it. You don't have to jump on the "you're being disrespectful, how dare you swear at me" kind of bandwagon. You can decide that you're going to not escalate that situation. And you can decide later on you're going to talk about language, and do you remember what the language rules are in this house? You know, so think, think about what you need to have a battle about, and what I'm going to say is you don't need to have a battle unless there's a very dangerous situation going on.
You don't need to be the winner. It's a really hard mindset to step away from. I know. You know, I remember speaking to a foster parent about 4 or 5 years ago now, and he said, but you know, he's going to win. He'll win. He's being the winner. And I was like, if you're thinking about in those terms, we've got a long way to go, really, because we're in this for the long haul. We're in it for the long haul. You know, winning is getting your child to be able to form relationships, getting them to adulthood and the ability to form relationships. That is how you win. It isn't about being the big, bad, controlling, frightening adults. They've had enough of those people in their life. They don't need you to show them that adults can be big and powerful, because they already know that. We need to show them a different way. Gerard, I just wanted to ask you something, because this is a question that I think is right up your street. The question here is, if a child displays high level aggression towards main foster carer, do you recommend some form of martial arts to help to learn control and discipline, or will it make matters worse?
Yeah, I think as somebody who practiced martial arts from about age 8 myself, and I've been around that for an awful long time. You know, I've done the whole Mr. Miyagi, Far Eastern Odyssey in Japan, and so on. It's a really interesting question. I believe, so it's my opinion, that a good, quite traditional martial arts a gym with the white pajamas and the Far Eastern traditions, the bowing and the kneeling down and all of that, probably not an impact version, so not your taekwondo or karate, but probably judo. If the teacher is a sensitive and well-educated coach, then I think it could be an excellent way to help that child to start to understand the dynamics of violence. The way I've explained this on the courses over the years is that in judo, for example, you go in and over the course of an hour, you get thrown down 100 times and you get to throw somebody else about 100 times. So it's a 50-50 relationship with the violence. 50% of the time you're the victim, 50% of the time you're the winner. And over 6 months, a year, 2 years, or 10 years of that, it tends to, its entire purpose, the way the training is set up like that, is to even the person out, to polish them in such a way that they understand it in a deeper way, the connection they have with violence. But like if you take your young person to the local cage fighting gym, which is pretty much set up to perpetuate violence and a hierarchy of violence, that isn't going to work out. But you could find a boxing gym nearby. You know, what you're looking for is like a 60-year-old grizzled veteran boxer who's seen these kids before, and boxing is really disciplined sport as well. So I would be a proponent for that, but it would have to be the right environment and the right coach. I think it could work for some children.
Sorry, Jane?
I was just saying, we have to make the right individual choice for our families. So some children will respond really, really well to that, and some won't.
Mm-hmm.
So you need to. Sometimes we don't know until we try. It's really as simple as that. You know, make the best choice that you can. Don't beat yourself up if you get it wrong. You know, you're trying. You're still learning. We're all making mistakes, and one of the great things that we can do is to let our children know that it's okay to try something and to make a mistake. That's a valuable lesson for them.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, we're not underestimating here. The three of us are really, really well aware that what we're talking about here is like the tip of the iceberg. With the hour we've got, and the number, like literally hundreds of questions that we've had, and because we go out and we deliver this training, normally face to face, or we're not in this situation, we are aware of the very high level of need out there. And we're also very aware that as parents, you're given misinformation a lot of the time. You're told you're not allowed to touch the child, you're not allowed to keep yourself safe, you're not allowed to shut the door. And all of that is covered within the course about what you can do legally and what you can't do. Because someone just asked a minute ago, actually, you know, but what can I do? Because if I leave, they'll trash the house. And I thought, well, I know Gerard would be very happy to talk about that.
So the question, what if I leave the house?
Yeah, if I leave the house, they'll trash the house. So therefore, I can't keep anyone safe. That's what the question was.
Yeah, I mean, leaving the house is probably a real last resort. But it depends. Again, I'll go back to something you said, Sarah. Is like, depends on whether I'm leaving as part of a strategy, and I have my my little bag with the keys to my car and the keys to the front door, and maybe a bar of chocolate for myself, and my phone is in there. Yeah, exactly. Or whether we've not thought about this and we're leaving in just a state of distress, and we're running out because we're in fear. And so that's the first distinction I would make. There's absolutely no issue with planning to leave the house, especially if, number one, we've got a lot of people on the call here who are saying, I'm struggling with my own triggers here. This child seems to have found my buttons and I'm in the process of dealing with them, but sometimes they just push my buttons. And I think that's one of the moments where you go, that's it, I'm out of here. Now, in regards to having the child trash the house, again, I mean, I know this is, I'm again, in a very short session, it's hard to not sound a bit too simplistic, but I think it seems to me, having dealt with lots of these issues over the years, that we do need to kind of lock down the house in terms of the valuable things, the nice things that we have, and so on. But of course, coming back to it, safety is first. You can't therapeutically parent anybody if you're not safe. And if leaving the house is the strategy that's open to you, then that might be the way to go. Also, I'm not sure. It would be interesting if we were in a group session to be able to get these answers, but sometimes what's fueling the situation is the audience. I had a foster parent the other day, the same one that we were talking about kicking the radiator. I said, if you left that room and walked into the cushion room, the room we're going to designate with all the cushions, what would she do? And the woman immediately said to me, she said, oh, she'd follow me because she can't stand being in there on her own. She needs an audience. So it's kind of an interesting strategy, if you haven't tried it yet, is to see what happens if you just walk away. And I know I love Sarah's video on YouTube where she calls you phone a friend and start narrating, and talking about the incident. It's the same idea. You kind of emotionally leave the chaos to go somewhere, which is, that safe base that you talk about. So.
Yeah, and actually, just thinking about that, Gerard, that I used to use it. It's a really good way. It's a distraction for the child, so it's quite a good early intervention. Beth has just said, I'll pretend to phone a friend, because you are actually mentally bringing somebody else in. And we had a lot of questions from single parents, a lot of women that say, I'm on my own, the child's bigger than me. When you mentally bring somebody else in and say, oh, hang on a minute, oh, there's just a call, yeah, and you pretend to take a call, say, no, so-and-so's is a bit upset at the moment. You can speak out loud at what you see and what you see is going on, and you can do empathic commentary without saying it to the child. And that can help to really regulate the child and bring them down. And also it can help them to pull back from doing the violent action because there's a witness, because there's somebody else there. Also, at the same time, one of the little strategies that I used to use with my children, your children are going to be very similar, likely to be hypervigilant. So if I had a child coming at me, like literally coming towards me, and they're all pumped up like this and their fists were like this and ready to go, one of the things I used to do is I used to look past them and do this. Oh, what's that? And they would always stop and turn around, and it was just enough. It just gave me enough time to move away. Because they're hypervigilant, they want to see what you're looking at. So that's just like a really quick strategy that I always try to share. Jane, did you want to add anything to that? Oh, sorry, Gerard, come back in with that then.
So quick strategies that I've talked with people about recently. Number one is a strategy we call reverse yelling. So a lot of people, you get somebody up in your face shouting and screaming, calling you names. we call it reverse yelling, where you drop the volume. I know that, Sarah, you talk about matching the effect.
Yeah.
Also a strategy, similar strategy, but suddenly dropping down to a whisper and just getting a very calm tone and a volume that's really low can be enough of a pattern interrupt to just have them give you that moment, if you like. And also one we call the sports commentator. So I stopped something at my kitchen table the other day by just sitting back at one moment and going, here we are at the dinner table in the OD household. On my right, I have, and now, and I think she just scored a point, and there might be a penalty, I'm not sure. But anyway, it just got, and I used a very kind of silly tone, and we just started narrating it live like a sports commentator would. And they all just stopped and looked at me. Everybody paused and they broke out laughing. But this idea of interrupting the pattern, I think, is really important. And of course, with your stuff, you call it playfulness.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. So I was going to say about the leaving the house. Funnily enough, with my daughter, sometimes all I had to do to get her to stop was to open the front door. And sometimes if I went out to the front of the house with a cup of tea, she would also stop. She'd come out and try and bait me, but it was much easier for me to manage when I was sat outside the front, and she wouldn't escalate. Well, I mean, in the end, she did, but that was sort of later on in the game. And I think sometimes we can come across a strategy by accident that actually works out to be a really good one. I think I noticed something called Eileen Potter coming up about boundaries, and I'm wondering whether that's about, well, you're always telling us to keep our boundaries secure, but then you're saying if they're yelling at you to back down, and I'm wondering if that's what's bothering you a bit there. But really, what we're talking about is extreme situations where we're really likely to escalate a situation into a place where we don't want to be. If you're in that situation, then think about a way to come out of that situation safely for yourself. And remember, if you take charge of a situation by saying to your child, you know what, I think you're right, and I've just decided it's really a bad idea for us to argue. I'm not going to argue with you about this. I've decided I'm not going to argue with you about this. You're still taking charge of it.
Yeah, and Jane, you just reminded me of something there. A lot of the time, what we get, we talked about winning earlier. Sometimes it's also really tempting, and I know I've done it. I've made these mistakes where you've got a child who's in your face and they're being all kind of like angry and aggressive, and then they say something that's really unacceptable and makes you like this, and then they might walk away. And I've had foster parents in that situation where they have followed the child and been hit and said to me, they hit me, they were right, and then the child's got a record of being aggressive. And I say to them, where were you standing? What did you do? And when I've unpicked it, they have had exactly this situation. They have followed the child, and then they were standing in the doorway of the child's bedroom, and the child had no exit. So for the child to get out, because a lot of them will run if they can. Someone just mentioned about open spaces, open air spaces, absolutely right. Quite a lot of the time, that cortisol will make them run. If you're in the way, prepare to be punched, hit, or pushed out the way. You've got to, when something's starting to go, look at where your exit is, and can the child exit? Can they get out safely? And I learned that like really early on when I just saw it in my children's face really when I was blocking their exit, and I realised that I was actually making them more fearful. Gerard, did you want to mention about that?
I think the point about blocking exits is well made. We do talk a lot about the isolation and containment strategies. So doors are a really important point here. And earlier on, I think I talked about the fact that you might walk into a room and pull the door shut behind you. There's also walking out of a room and pulling the door shut as you go. In the most extreme of circumstances where you need to keep yourself safe, there is to an extent guidance that and certainly the law allows for, in certain, again, extreme circumstances, where you can pull a door shut and keep it shut if you had somebody running at you. Just to caveat that, that's not the child's, it can be the child's room, but not where you followed them in and basically escalated it further. But that principle of isolating, of being in separate rooms essentially when the violence is happening, and sometimes you have to enforce that. And maybe on that point, you know, just to talk about the physical strategies that we teach, one half of the physical strategies that we teach for you guys is about how to not get injured, you know, how to not be injured in the most serious of ways. So the worst thing I think that could happen to any of you is that you get a head injury, or you become unconscious. So when we do physical training with you, that's the first thing that we work on, is to make sure that it's very difficult for somebody to hurt your head or your neck. Okay. And that's the main part of our protective strategies. The other strategies that we teach, the other half, if you like, is how to physically control a child momentarily. You know, for example, to pull them off the radiator that they're pulling off the wall. I saw one of the comments there. To pull them off the 10-month-old who's being attacked and redirect them. Now, those only really happen, they're only really useful strategies if the child is kind of primary age. As soon as you've got a teenager on your hands, the strategies have to change somewhat to you getting out of that person's space. You know, physical intervention is inherently risky. All the guidance when we work in schools, all the guidance says you never restrain a child by yourself. So there's some important kind of discussions that need to be had around that, because it's just very risky. And so I just wanted to give you an insight there for a moment or two as to, you know, what we can help you with physical strategies. The fostering and particular regulations allow for that in exceptional circumstances. The common law and criminal law allow for the use of protective force. So anybody who's, you know, under other kinds of advice or erroneous guidance, then that's something that we can work on with you.
Yeah, I just saw a question come up there, Joe, when you were speaking, where somebody just said, you know, with their 5-year-old, that they often feel like they might hurt him when they are trying to restrain him or trying to hold on to him to stop him doing it, because, you know, they've obviously not been trained how to do it. And I think that's one of the really critical things, is that often there's these barriers in the way where some social workers or well-meaning other professionals will say, you know, you're not allowed to learn that. Well, the risk then is that you may inadvertently hurt the child by just kind of trying to grab them in a way that's really quite dangerous. So you are allowed to learn how to do that. And someone said here, we foster for age, they have a total no restraint policy. Well, I'm sure Joe will tell you, it's against the law. They can't do that.
Yeah, every other person in society is allowed to put their hands on that child if they need to, and if it's proportionate in the circumstances. Everybody, police, nurses, social workers, the security guard at the local Tesco, they're all allowed to put their hands on that child if the child's being violent. So the idea that because you're a foster carer, you're not allowed, or an adopter or whomever, it is ridiculous. And that particular policy wouldn't last more than 10 seconds in a courtroom.
Exactly. Exactly. And if you are in that situation, because I know we've got to wind it up soon, if you're in that situation where you really feel, I am absolutely desperate, I'm terrified, I'm getting hurt, and you need this training, if you contact NATP or you contact Rosie, any of us, we are very happy to write to the social worker and explain their legal obligations to you. We're very sure of our ground in that. And there's absolutely nothing that would prevent you in accessing the training that you need to have. You know, you should not be scared of a child, not only for your benefit, but for theirs. They need to feel that you are safe, that you're confident, and that you can manage them. Because otherwise, if their main parent or main carer is scared of them, there's no room for growth there. So it's in everyone's interest. And what we do find, yes, it is the same in Scotland. And what we do find is that by doing the training that and I see we've got some people on here this evening that have done day 1 training. The irony of it is, because the foster parents go away and the adopters go away and they're feeling much more confident, they don't need to use the techniques. It's just that the child picks up do you know what, they're not scared, they're confident, and the violence goes right down. So, you know, it's an ironic fact that by having the training, it doesn't mean you're more likely to use it. You're less likely to use it because the child becomes more secure and less violent. So, okay, I think we probably need to wind it up unless there's anything extra that Jane or Gerard you want to add.
I'll just add one short thing. Sarah, I know that I mentioned fostering regulations quite a bit because there are no regulations around adopters, and there's some biological parents and guardians and things coming up on the chat here asking if it's the same for them, and the answer is it absolutely is. You know, like I said, any person in society outside of your house is allowed to put their hands on the child if they need to, in an emergency. And so it applies to you in exactly the same way. There's no prohibition under law for you to use force, yeah. except the well-meaning professionals who often haven't read the law or the regulations themselves.
In answer to the question about NBR, it's not the same as NBR. We take the de-escalation principles, but we take them further, and we do more with it. And we add in, so that we're able to help parents feel more confident, we add in the physical interventions within the rules. But NBR is good as far as it goes, but not all of the strategies are useful for adopted or fostered or special guardian children or children from trauma from any background. And some of them are positively escalating if you try to do them, such as sit-ins, or being very confrontational, having an announcement, or those sorts of things. You know, there are some things that will escalate a child. And actually, you know, the most useful thing you can do for your child is to get as much information you can about their history and link it to their behaviour. Think about whether if they've suffered domestic violence, if they've suffered neglect, if they've been powerless and vulnerable in their lives, then their default is going to be to fight and to be powerful. So we have to kind of really get to the roots of it, and that's what takes the time, folks. But then you can find your beautiful child that was the child that you always wanted anyway. You just need to get to the root of the problem first.
Okay, thanks, Jane. I've just seen that Rosie has said that she's going to email everyone and give all the relevant links. Just a quick reminder that there is ongoing training. So we're going to be running a de-escalation full course in hour-long sections so that you can do a lot more on this if you want to join in that. If you're a social worker, we've had a lot of people saying, I've got some foster parents that are right on the edge or adopters that are in a terrible situation. You might need the one-to-one service for that, like I say, where you have the consultation, removal of triggers, and then strategies. And it's 3 steps to reconnect to your child. So we can do all of those things. You will have an email outlining all of that. There is somewhere for you to go. As I say, we have very good feedback on the training, but it is about using the training effectively. You know, when you come to training, you do need to then take that away with you and use it and really think about some of the strategies and how best to apply that to your child. So thank you very much for joining us, everybody. And sorry, some of the sound was a bit dodgy, but that was out of our control, and it won't be like that next time. Okay. So nice seeing you all.
Hi, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Hi. You can wait.